welcome you to the third event in this year's Holocaust Memorial Week. And I'd also like to take a moment to remind you that tomorrow our speaker will be Henrik Lindbergh, a Holocaust survivor and the author of several fictional and non-fictional works on the Holocaust. He is perhaps best known for his memoir, The Jewish War, and he will be speaking here tomorrow in this same room at the same time, hopefully with a working microphone. This year marks the 27th Holocaust Memorial Week at Oregon State University. And if you're a faithful attendant, you've probably noticed that every year this week falls somewhere else in the spring calendar. The precise dates shift every year because our events line up with the National Day of Remembrance, a commemorative event first initiated by Congress in 1978. Every year, the National Day of Remembrance corresponds to the 27th day of Nisan of the Hebrew calendar, a day that marks the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on April 19, 1943. This is my 6th year in helping to organize commemorative events here at OSU, and I believe our purpose here is multifold. First and foremost, we must remember and honor the millions of men, women, and children murdered by the Nazi regime. Ideally, this week should also make us vigilant defenders of human rights and human dignity. The year 1945, sadly, did not signify an end to genocide, and it is my hope that this week will make you more mindful of events taking place in our own time and in our own world. This week also provides us with opportunities to understand why and how the Nazi regime was able to murder 6 million Jews, over 200,000 Roma and Sinti, and that's a conservative number, 3 million Russian POWs, and millions more in the forests and killing centers of Eastern Europe. The scope of the crime compels us to conceive of complicity in broader terms. For the Nazi Party and the SS could not have committed such a human catastrophe or operated more than 42,000 camps and ghettos without extensive participation or, at minimum, compliance from German society. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Peter Hayes, has devoted much of his career to documenting this complicity, particularly on the part of German business. He is a professor of history and German at Northwestern University, and he is one of the foremost historians of German business in the Third Reich. His first book, Industry and Ideology, was a meticulously researched study of I.G. Farben, a firm perhaps best known for operating a factory at Auschwitz and making use of concentration camp labor. His study documented I.G. Farben's slide into complicity, raised questions about immorality within capitalism, and has been described as the best work that exists on business under the Nazis. His second book, From Cooperation to Complicity, studies a firm named Degussa, a much smaller enterprise that nonetheless played a critical role to the Holocaust, particularly since it helped the regime to launder gold stolen from concentration camp inmates, and because it controlled a subsidiary that made Zyklon-B, the pesticide used in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. In numerous other publications, Dr. Hayes has explored the complicity of German banks and expanded our understanding of Aryanization and the exploitation of slave labor. This is only a hint of his lengthy record of scholarship, which is both remarkable and intimidating in its depth and breadth. Dr. Hayes has held numerous fellowships, too many to list tonight, but I would like to draw attention to one in particular, the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence Fellowship at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I have selected this particular fellowship because it gives me an opportunity to thank the Holocaust Museum for supporting this presentation tonight. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Peter Hayes.
Thank you all for coming. At the ripe old age of 66, this is the first time in my life that I've been in Oregon. That's not counting the time I went to visit Whitman College in Walla Walla, and they drove me down to the border and a little bit over so I could put my toe in the state and claim that I had been here. I understand you have problems with Californians. And then you try to make sure that they don't know about how beautiful it is up here. I'm here to tell you that you should probably be a little worried about the rest of us, now that I've seen what this state looks like. The topic I'm going to discuss tonight lends itself to sensationalism and has been subjected to quite a lot of it. One reason for that is that until about 15 years ago, we really didn't know much about what German corporations and banks had done during the Nazi era, let alone about why. So a lot of room existed for suspicion, supposition, and innuendo. Yes, the United States had put a number of prominent corporate figures on trial after World War II, notably 2 directors of the Dresdner Bank, 23 chief executives of IG Farben, the giant chemicals combine, and several leaders of the Krupp armaments, coal, and steel firm. But the prosecutions weren't very effective, largely because the American lawyers acted like they were pursuing an antitrust case rather than a human rights one. And the issues the trials presented rapidly got caught up in and obscured by the Cold War confrontation between capitalism and communism. By 1951, even the rather small number of convicted corporate executives had gone free. Thereafter, the records that might have told us what happened and why remained largely closed. Most firms locked the doors of their archives and turned their efforts to creating a mythology of how business suffered under the dictates of a terroristic and totalitarian Nazi state. This is the way matters remained for decades, long enough for the new generation of leaders of German industry to believe the stories their elders told them. The 1990s changed all of this and exposed an enormous documentary record to researchers. How? Basically, through the interaction of the process of globalization with an innovation in American law, the class action suit. Globalization meant that many German corporations that had been involved with the crimes in the Third Reich later acquired American operations or subsidiaries and wanted a good reputation in US markets. The legal change meant that classes of people who felt wronged could gather together to sue in American courts those German entities for the recovery of ill-gotten gains from the assets of the US operations and subsidiaries. In other words, it became possible to recover the money earned by crimes in the Holocaust in American courts. And up until the 1990s, this was not the case. And of course, any of you who know something about the process of American courts knows that when there's a suit, they begin with a process of discovery. That means the lawyers ask to see all the evidence that the sued party has in its possession. This means that those locked up corporate archives were suddenly vulnerable to exposure. As these suits multiplied in the late 1990s, the German parties adopted, largely as a PR strategy, the practice of asking prominent historians to examine their long-concealed records and write reports on what they contained. A flurry of corporate histories resulted. Books about Mercedes, that is to say about Daimler-Benz, the company that makes the Mercedes vehicle, about BMW and about Volkswagen appeared. Books about the fashion company Hugo Boss, the construction firms Holtzmann and Hochtief, the publisher Bertelsmann, the successor firms of IG Farben, which were BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, the Deutsche and the Dresdner banks, Krupp, and my own book on Degussa, the German Gold and Silver Separation Institute, the firm that held the patents on Zyklon-B, the gas used in Auschwitz, and that turned the precious metals stolen from Jews, including from the mouths of their corpses, into usable assets for the Third Reich. Indeed, so many of these books have appeared that they now take up 15 feet of shelf space in my library at home. This outpouring of research provides remarkable insight into the degree to which everyday Germans became complicit in the crimes of the Nazi state, and also an insight into the very recognizable and perhaps to us almost familiar reasons why. A story that usually has been told simply as a matter of hatred and greed, of anti-Semitism and profit-seeking, turns out to be somewhat more complicated than that.
In fact, when one looks closely at the internal records of German firms, one finds something rather astounding. Among corporate executives, anti-Semitism functioned less as a motive from the beginning than as a rationalization as the Holocaust escalated. 1943 was not the ruthless behavior of German corporations in 1943 was not predictable from the starting situation of 1933. German corporations did not play a very prominent or active role in bringing Hitler to power, and most corporate executives mistrusted him and his economic ideas at the outset. Though some of these executives thought Jews had acquired too much influence in German life, they certainly did not generally believe, as the Nazis did, that the Jews were at the root of the nation's problems. They did share some overlapping interests with the Nazi Party, above all a desire to rein in the trade unions and to restore German national pride, but that was pretty much it when it comes to the congruence of their particular positions. But once Hitler acquired power, the nation's business leaders fell in line, concluding that discretion was the better part of valor, and that more was to be gained by going along than by raising objections. This meant, almost from the very beginning of Nazi rule, throwing their Jewish colleagues to the wolves. Of course, instances of bigotry, strengthened by envy and greed, show up in some of the narratives of the expulsion of Jews from high-ranking business positions and in the takeovers of Jewish-owned companies in Germany. The desire for a colleague's corner office led some Gentile managers to lead the charge to drive Jewish colleagues out of their companies. But businesses had countervailing interests too. The big German banks, in particular, worried that client firms taken over from Jews by inexperienced new owners might lead to unrepaid loans and other losses. The more common pattern was different, and this is where I come to my point about familiar to and recognizable to us. The language of self-interest and self-defense usually sufficed to make corporate managers turn on their Jewish counterparts. They dressed their actions up always in the language of duty. One had to do certain things in the prevailing context, quote, for the good of the firm, unquote. A powerful illustration of how this worked is the story of Charles Rosenthal and the company he headed in 1933, the Philipp Holzmann AG, the nation's largest construction and road building firm. And what happened will be familiar to anybody who knows anything about Chicago politics, I refer to where I come from, or the way in which pressure is applied in contemporary life. Fritz Todt, a man who was appointed to direct the building of the Autobahns, convened a meeting with the namesake of this company. The company was the chairman of the board was a man named Philipp Holzmann, and said to Holzmann, the construction season is coming. If your firm, remember this is the largest construction firm in Germany, if your firm would like to bid to have the right to have government contracts to build the Autobahns, there is one precondition. You must fire the managing partner of your firm, the president, the chief operating officer, whose name was Charles Rosenthal. Charles Rosenthal was 29 years old. It was virtually unheard of in German corporate life for somebody to be at the top of a corporation at that young age in this era, and he was also a Jew. In other words, the principal owner of the company, the leader of the board of directors, was told that the future financial health of the company, its opportunities to make money, depended on complying with Nazi anti-Semitic policies. Holzmann was actually a fairly decent guy, and he took this conversation, or reported this conversation, to Rosenthal himself, and said, this is the position I've been put in. What should I do? What do you want me to do? We've worked together for the last 10 years. I promoted you from one position after another in the company. I would like to stand by you, but you understand what the position I put in is. And Rosenthal said, I'll resign. for the good of the firm. Now, this did not always happen, if you will, quasi-voluntarily on the part of the executive involved. Sometimes people declined to resign, but in many cases, the regime was adept at putting commercial pressure on commercial enterprises to do ideological things. As this example makes clear, the Nazi regime was skilled at using a mix of government controls, compulsion, and the exploitation of competition among firms to get the behavior that the Reich wanted. I've gone so far as to call this a Skinner box economy, one in which the government used a mix of rewards and punishments, much like the psychologist B.F. Skinner used food pellets and shocks to condition pigeons to respond to the stimuli he wanted. The devices available to the government ranged from refusing to authorize mergers that companies desired, unless Jews were forced out of the companies involved, or to threatening to start state-owned companies that would produce the goods the regime wanted and behave as the regime wanted, to restrict access, as in the case of Holzmann, to government contracts, and to hinting that the government could always ask a competitor to do its dirty work. But despite all of this, considerable room to maneuver in dealing with the regime's persecutorial policies existed, at least at certain times, provided that the firms and the executives involved exercised some imagination. Let me give you three, I don't want to take you too far into the weeds here, but let me give you three illustrations of stories that show how corporate executives had some leeway in dealing with the Nazi state. The first one is drawn from the history of I.G. Farben, which had a photographic filmmaking factory in a town called Roth, not far from Berlin. In April of 1933, the local Nazi activists in the factory came to the head of it, a man named Fritz Gajewski, and demanded that all of the Jewish supervisors in any role in the company be fired. Gajewski, who had just joined the Nazi party, Gajewski said in good German, "Ich bitte unbedingt sein." I need time to think that one over. And then a few weeks later, when the representatives came back, Gajewski sent his assistant out to talk to them. And they said something very, in retrospect, clever. Gajewski sent the message to these Nazi activists, and he said, "National Socialism did not replace democracy in Germany in order to establish democracy in my factory." You get it? He talked Nazi to the Nazis. Only what he said was, "I'll talk Nazi to you, but the punchline favors me. If the Führer runs this country, I run this factory. And you don't tell me what to do." Now, the remarkable story is the man he defended in this particular case was a man named Kushman, who was a Jew. And that man continued to work at that factory until the spring of 1938. In fact, at the I.G. Farben factory at Bochum, not a single Jew was released in the first 5 years of Hitler's rule. While at other I.G. Farben factories all across the country, where people didn't have the same wit that Gajewski had, the managers knuckled under and fired the Jews. A second example, taken from the history of Degussa, this has to do with the takeover, the so-called Aryanization of the company. It involved a subsidiary of Degussa and a suburb of Berlin called Grünau. And Degussa had bought the company from the Jewish owners in the 1920s, but Degussa had left the Jewish owners in important managerial positions and left them in possession of 26% of the stock. In late 1937, the Nazi activists in the workforce came to the manager of this factory and they said, "We want to compete for the honor of being a national socialist model factory." It was a national competition. You got a plaque to hang in front of the factory. You got a little bit of prestige and so forth if you got it. Now, the problem is, under the rules of the competition, we can't compete for that if there are any Jews in important managerial functions or if Jews own more than 25% of the stock. So, the issue was presented by this company in Grünau to Degussa as the owner. And the chairman of the company, Degussa, was a man named Ernst Busemann. he left behind an extensive correspondence between him and the manager of this subsidiary. The correspondence is extraordinarily touching because Busemann writes, I have known these people, their family was named Meyer. I have known these people for 15 years. They have been good and respectable businessmen. I trust them, I have confidence in them, and so forth. But now, I am put in a position that will decide their whole economic future, and I know there will be no appeal from my decision. And then comes the fateful sentence in the document that summarizes all of this. Aber es hat keinen Zweck, gegen den Strom zu schwimmen. But there is no point in swimming against the stream. And then Busemann did something remarkable. He thought of a way to compensate these people over what they deserved for their property. And the way this goes is, again, I don't want to take too much into the weeds, but they own 26% of the stock. Stock in Germany in those days was denominated in terms of its face value, not in terms of its market exchange value. So what he did is he took the 26% of the stock in that company, which was at face value of X, but a market value of X minus about 15. And he gave them stock in IG Farben that was worth X plus 25. You got it? He went out of his way, he exercised his imagination. He couldn't protect them from the decrees that were determined to drive the Jews out of the economy. But he thought he would at least give them something for all of the years in which he had worked with them and trusted them and so on. A third example, this one a quite remarkable example to do with Degussa, which built a factory in the then very far eastern German town of Gleiwitz. It's now in Poland, but in those days it was on the border between Germany and Poland. And this is a factory that produced a substance called carbon black. I had to learn a lot of chemistry when I was writing these books. Has anyone ever heard of what carbon black is? Anyone? One? One? Do I hear two? Two? Carbon black is a form of soot. Okay? You have no idea how many thousand forms of soot there are. Carbon black is, as Groucho Marx used to say, a common household product that you find around the house every day. How many people in the audience are old enough to remember that? Carbon black is in every tire on the road. It is also, in its form, white carbon black. You may think that's contradictory. There is such a thing as white carbon black. It is a basic component of every flip-flop in the world. Okay? This is a really valuable little piece of soot. Anyway, Degussa had developed a process for making this thing. The first German firm that figured out how to make this stuff out of German raw materials. The government wanted it desperately because, obviously, it's a key component of tires, and tires are a key component of all kinds of military, motorized transport, and so on. They were therefore induced to build a factory out there at the border of Poland and Germany in those days, and the inducements included the promise that the government would provide the labor to construct the factory. Initially, that labor was supposed to be captured Soviet prisoners of war. And this is one of these rare cases where the documents about the labor negotiations actually survive, and there is a protocol, a set of minutes of a conversation between the Degussa executives and the local representative of the German Labor Ministry, at which, this occurs in January 1941, at which the Labor Ministry representative looks at the Degussa person and says, we don't have enough Russian prisoners of war. We promised you Russian prisoners of war. We don't have them. They've all been dying in our prison camps. We just don't have any more to give you. Wie wäre es mit Juden? How would it be with Jews? And at that moment, the man whose job is to build this new factory looks at them and says, I guess they'll be okay. And that is the source of the delivery to this Gleiwitz factory of inmates from Auschwitz, men, to build the factory. And then later, beginning in 1943, the delivery to this factory of women from the last ghetto remaining in Upper Silesia at Sosnowice, delivering those women to the factory, and they were to be the women who ran the assembly line that produced the soot and bagged it. Now, when this factory was captured by the Russians in 1945, most of its records disappeared. There were a few scraps left, in the Degussa archive, and as I looked through them, I discovered something remarkable. There were monthly tallies of how many people were in the labor camp, separated by men and women. And I noticed that from month to month, the number of men kept changing, but the number of women never changed. And I knew from various other documents about arrivals of fresh shipments of prisoners from Auschwitz, but there was no trace of any other arrivals of women from the ghettos of Upper Silesia. The logical conclusion, but one I was reluctant to make because these sources are fragmentary, the logical conclusion is somehow, under the conditions of slave labor in this plant in Gleiwitz, the women stayed alive and the men were dying. Now, if the manager of the company had no control over their fate, how could that result happen? How could the women survive and the men tend to die? Yes, the men worked outside in the cold. It was harder, the mortality rate might be higher, but no women dying? And then and a little later, I was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and they have a remarkable resource there called the Survivor Registry. And the Survivor Registry tells you not only about where people were involved with the Holocaust, what camp they were in, what ghetto, so on and so forth, but if they're still alive, where they live. And lo and behold, there were 3 people living in suburban Washington who were in the labor force in this factory at Gleiwitz. So I called up a woman named Manya Friedman who lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and she was kind enough to agree to see me. And I went out to see her, and I found out something stunning. She was the forewoman of the labor battalion that in the camp that made this cotton black in the factory. And so I looked at her and I said, I'm looking at these numbers, and these numbers suggest to me that those women were somehow being kept alive, even under the terrible conditions of slave labor in a German factory. Is that possible? Could that be true? She said yes. We all arrived together in April 1943. And when we left in January 1945, because they were evacuated as the Russians were coming, in that interval, only 2 people died, 2 women. They died because on the day that the SS took over the management of those barracks attached to the factory, which was the day the Allies landed at D-Day. On that day, those women were so terrified by the arrival of the SS, with which they had had previous dealings, that they climbed up to the highest point on the factory grounds and threw themselves off. Now this story told me something remarkable. The manager of this plant at Gleiwitz clearly must have done something to keep all those women alive. They had no medicines, they had the standard food rations. Somehow he cheated the system. And he didn't do it for the men. And this points out what is characteristic of all of these stories that I have just told you. Executives tended to exercise the imagination that enabled them to help or save Jews, only when it coincided with their corporate interests. The Buseman case is a partial exception because Buseman knew the Meyers and liked them and so on and so forth. But it was easiest for him in December 1937 to have a relatively smooth and amicable solution to this problem. And if paying the Meyers a little more in the stock made them go away a little faster, that was in his corporate interest. The remarkable thing about the factory at Gleiwitz is, of course, that I realized that he didn't care whether those male workers survived. The manager didn't care. Why? Because they were useless to him once the factory was built. They were construction workers. But the women operated the factory. The women knew how the machines worked. The women were capable of generating the product that was going to make his profit. They were a resource that he could not treat as expenditure. And so somehow, I don't know from the records how, somehow he had the ability to make the slave labor system less onerous for some people than it was for others. But when self-interest did not encourage decency in these fashions, the effects of corruption and the inversion of moral values in Nazi Germany, this is terribly important to understand. After all, this was a country in which every source of every radio, every newspaper, every one of these sources of information proclaimed that prejudice was good and patriotic, not bad and harmful. In that environment, the inversion of moral values became very apparent. Degussa, which had tried to help the Meyers in late 1937, behaved ruthlessly only a few months later to the Margulies family in Vienna in an almost identical situation. They managed a company, they owned 26% of the shares, so on and so forth, and instead of offering them for their property goods that were valued at more than the property, the finance director of Degussa simply said, they'll have to take what I give them. And that was that. 2 years after that, Degussa literally advised the Gestapo on how to dispossess a Jewish owner of a metal smelting firm that the German company wanted in the occupied part of Czechoslovakia. Another striking example of this sort of corruption is the actions of the leader of the Allianz Insurance Company, the nation's largest, after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. To avoid having to pay the Jewish policy owners whose windows had been smashed and personal property destroyed, that executive argued to Hermann Göring in emphatically Nazi terms that no German enterprise should have to pay the supposed instigators of what had happened, that is, the allegedly criminal and disloyal Jews. And besides, that paying the policyholders would lead to higher premium payments for loyal, so-called Aryan Germans. By making that argument, he got out not only of paying the Jewish policyholders, he got out of what Hermann Göring wanted as the second choice, which was paying Hermann Göring, paying the German state for the damage. And thus, he talked Nazi to a Nazi and achieved the corporate objectives. These transformations are demonstrations of the ways human ingenuity adapted to new contexts for its exercise. They are reminders that power magnifies the ideas of those who hold it, particularly when those ideas silence virtually all competing ideas and values in a society. Deference or adherence to these ideas becomes determinative of advancement or attaining one's goals. Conformity feeds on self-interest. And in terms of the effects on the victims, whether or not people actually believed Nazi ideology and embraced anti-Semitism virtually ceased to matter. What mattered is that people behaved in accordance with the ideology. And that was enough to crush the livelihoods and then the lives of the Jews the ideology targeted. During the war years, the dehumanization of the victims of the Holocaust in the eyes of corporate executives became most massively apparent in the slave labor system. Now people were treated as mere means to ends, as factors of production, not as human beings. But here too, the story is more complicated and alarming than the usual narrative indicates. Usually observers talk about the slave labor system as a profit-making enterprise, one in which the attraction to companies was that the laborers were cheap. This is largely wrong. The attraction was not cost, because the SS imposed high charges for the concentration camp inmates that composed the slave labor force. And the housing and other costs of the other foreigners who made up the forced labor population were also often higher than the value of their output. The attraction of the use of compulsory workers was their availability, not their price. And this, in order to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about the mathematics of the German labor market. 11 million German men were called up between 1939 and 1943. In 1939, before this happened, a larger share of German women were already working than ever became the case in World War II in either Britain or the US. Understand? Before there was Rosie the Riveter, there was Helga the something or other. And Helga outnumbered Rosie even before the war started. In other words, the labor force was inelastic, but the wartime demand for armaments and the like was burgeoning. The only solutions available to Nazi Germany were either to export production to the occupied countries or to import workers from the occupied countries. The regime chose the latter, and business largely agreed in order to prevent foreigners from learning trade secrets about production and to keep up with production goals as best the firms could. With regard to slave labor, as with regard to the so-called Aryanization of enterprises formerly owned by Jews, and even the sale of Zyklon-B, or Degussa's refining of precious metals, the role of monetary calculations was much more complicated than you might think. The immediate returns were often scant because the Nazi government made sure of that. It held profit margins down on the Zyklon. It demanded special prices for the metals refining. It used the shortage of labor to jack up the price of camp inmates. And it taxed away anything that the regime regarded as an excess profit on the takeover of a Jewish company. Let me give you the grisliest example. Total proceeds on the sale of Zyklon to Auschwitz over 4 years were $168,000 in today's US dollars. Total proceeds, 4 years. That's proceeds, that's not profit. Only about 1/4 of this substance was actually used to kill people. And the profits on that 1/4 were divided among 3 co-owners of the patent to Zyklon. In short, the booty was limited. Let me put the matter in a more shocking way. The cost of poison gas at Auschwitz came to about a penny a corpse. Clearly, the profit was even less. But the companies that nonetheless took advantage of the persecution of Jews in this and other forms were usually playing, not for short-term, but for long-term gains. And these were often more political than strictly economic. Meanwhile, they sought to achieve the commercial goals that they had on their horizons and justified their actions with reference to these goals. Corporate executives in Nazi Germany had a wide variety of ways of normalizing the atrocities they participated in. They told themselves they were doing something other than actually perpetrating atrocities. Sometimes they said, we're vindicating the private enterprise system by proving that companies can accomplish the goals the state sets, even though the Nazis often say that corporate selfishness stands in the way of national goals. Sometimes they said, we're simply carrying out long-standing commercial strategies that we had before the Nazis came into power and that have been the objectives of this enterprise for a long time. In I.G. Farben's case, the version of this was that they wanted to perfect a new synthetic chemical product, rubber from coal, which is what the firm planned to make at Auschwitz. Because their desire to do this dovetailed with the regime's desire to increase the production of the product and to put the factory in the part of Germany that the Allies couldn't bomb, which is the vicinity of Auschwitz, I.G. Farben became involved in the slave labor system. At Degussa, the long-standing strategy was a program of diversification, and that meant that when Jewish-owned factories became available on the market, Degussa was quick to buy them up, and often to tell themselves that they were doing a favor to the companies that they were acquiring because they'd been owned by long-time business partners and so forth. Sometimes the companies told themselves that what they were doing was preventing the loss of business or know-how to foreign competitors. When Bayer, the people who make Bayer aspirin, asked for forced laborers, it was trying to stop the transfer of aspirin production to occupied France. When Degussa agreed to build a new carbon black factory in Silesia with inmates from the ghettos there, one objective was to make sure a competing plant didn't go up in Allied Hungary. Sometimes the executives told themselves that what they were doing was reinforcing a potentially lucrative political alliance. At Auschwitz, IG Farben's builders knew that they could build their new factory faster with free laborers than with slaves. They knew also that the slaves were underproductive. That is, the value of what they did not equal what IG Farben paid the SS for them. But nonetheless, they kept asking for the slave laborers because the managers expected that the SS would reward them later. It's almost like a kickback scheme, if you will. Finally, toward the end of the war, the managers of German companies often told themselves that what they were doing was preserving the very existence of their firms by preventing shutdowns or by preventing the loss of equipment. The executives of Daimler-Benz knew in the final months of 1944 that the war was lost, but they kept begging for slave laborers to help them transfer machinery and other equipment to underground factory sites. Why? So the material would survive the war and provide the basis for new production later. Ironically, and worryingly, some of these long-term bets paid off. Degussa was 3 to 4 times more valuable in 1949 than it had been in 1925. And most of the gains came from meeting the arms needs of the Nazi regime and from the enduring possession after the war of most of the Jewish-owned companies that Degussa had acquired. The story with regard to slave labor is more ambiguous, however, because most of the plants that it was used to construct were in the far eastern portions of Germany, mostly Silesia, and they either were still unfinished when the Russians arrived in 1945, or they were taken over by Poland thereafter. Whatever the long-term outcome, the rationalizations that I've listed insulated the managers prior to 1945 from the full force of what they were doing. Still, the justifications weren't always enough, especially for those executives who saw the condition of the people they exploited. For them, something else was necessary, and they often resorted to the rationale that the regime provided: anti-Semitism. What happened in German industry was not, I think, as Shaw Friedlander claims, the spread before Hitler came to power of an ideology of redemptive anti-Semitism, of the removal of the Jews as the solution to all Germany's problems. But that spread certainly occurred after Hitler was in office. Germans in all walks of life fled into this ideology, not only as a vehicle of their own advantage, but also as the most powerful legitimation of what they were doing to Jews. Anti-Semitism became pervasive after 1933 in Germany in this fashion, especially in the German corporate world. What this story shows, I believe, is the seducibility of people by self-interest, weakness, fear, a limited sense of obligation and responsibility, sometimes by self-pity. Many of these German corporate executives whose diaries you read, whose letters you read, are preoccupied with how tough it is for them to persecute, not how tough it is for people to be persecuted. That is a classic form of self-pity. And by patriotism, identity, and the attraction of what are called the secondary virtues, above all a sense of duty and professionalism. Duty and professionalism are very good things, as long as they are put at the service of things that are even better. All of these impulses helped numb many Germans to the suffering they inflicted. These are timeless, universal forces and temptations. They highlight the ability of governments that rule by terror and indoctrination to transform traditional, sometimes apparently admirable values into brutal ones. The process could have been deflected then, as now, only by united action in defense of firmly held and widely accepted countervailing values, such as the worth and sanctity of individual life, the moral and practical superiority of democracy to authoritarianism, and the priority of means over ends. Just stopping for a moment to reflect on how difficult these defenses are to build and maintain is enough to make us understand how easily even a sophisticated society can descend into barbarism when the levers of power and reward structures push in that direction. I'm often asked how and when Nazism and the Holocaust might have been stopped. And my answer may serve as a way of summarizing what I've said tonight. I think I know exactly when. And it's so early a date that the flip side of the answer is depressing. For the implication is that neither of these things could have been stopped any later. What's the date? April 1st, 1933. This is the day that most people who study the Holocaust know as the day of the boycott of the Jewish-owned shops in Germany, the stationing of stormtroopers in front of the stores in an attempt to discourage other Germans from shopping at those places. It was also accompanied by offices of Jewish law offices and doctors' practices and so forth. What is much less well known is another occupation that occurred on that day. The Nazi stormtrooper sent a unit which charged into the national headquarters in Berlin of the Reichsverband der Deutschen Industrie, the National Association of German Industry. This is the pressure group, the lobby group of the largest and most powerful corporations in the country. It was headed by the person who was generally considered the most powerful business executive in Germany, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Harburg, the head of the Krupp arms firm, and so forth. The stormtroopers who occupied the office had one demand. They insisted that the National Association of German Industry should fire all of its Jewish employees and all of the other employees whom the Nazis regarded as politically unreliable. This provoked the head, Gustav Krupp, into a little bit of confusion. This was an absolutely illegal demand. All of these people had labor contracts. The company did not have the right to break those labor contracts. But Krupp was, after all, a very important man, and he was the head of a very important organization. So he got on the phone, and he called Adolf Hitler. And he said, call off your dogs. We can't operate an economy, after all, the Depression is not over. We can't operate an economy with this kind of harassment. And Hitler replied by crying crocodile tears. He basically said, these stormtroopers who are occupying your offices, they have been with me through thick and thin as I have tried to reform this country and gather power and so forth. I cannot tell them not to demand the fruits of a National Socialist revolution now that it is here. In other words, Krupp asked the Chancellor of the country to get the stormtroopers out of his office, and the Chancellor said no. And then there was kind of a stalemate, and Krupp took the advice of his board. He asked them, what should I do? Most of them dodged an answer. One of them, a man named Georg von Müller-Oerlinghausen, these people all have names that just sound great. Oerlinghausen wrote him back and said, you can't knuckle under. If you give way now, we will have no moral ground to resist ever again. He was absolutely right. And Krupp caved. Krupp fired the co-workers. He fired all the Jews. He fired the people who were regarded as politically unreliable. Now, only the insistence at that moment, when Hitler's grasp on power was still weak, that the rule of law, in this case the labor contracts of the employees, had to be respected, would have slowed the Nazis. If Krupp wasn't willing to defend his co-workers, whom would he defend? The question the Holocaust poses over and over is who will defend whom? If we, like Krupp, don't have an answer to that question other than myself, then the haters, once they get their hands on power, are unstoppable, at least from within.